Good afternoon. And just in order to keep things moving, I think we want to get going. It is now 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So thank you for joining. For all those that got on right away or got on early, appreciate that. For those that don't know me, I am Dwayne Firminger, and I'm the monogastric team lead here in Ontario for Grand Valley Fortifiers. So that means I work with our poultry and our swine teams here in Ontario, as well as customers myself. And every now and then I get to work on some special projects. I'm glad to be the host of this event. Obviously, we're doing this sort of event like most of the world due to the COVID virus that we're dealing with. But also, Dr. Carr is not real close by, as many of you may know or may not. He is sitting down under. He is in Australia. So this is a global event, and we're glad he was willing to get up at 4 in the morning to join us to do this. So that's great. We've got close to 100 people registered for this event today, which is also great. You never know how that's going to go, but we really appreciate everyone taking their time to join us. And I think I'll just say I met John about 15 years ago here at Grand Valley. I've had the privilege of doing barn tours, meeting with producers, and many late night meals discussing all things swine with Dr. Carr. And usually those discussions run into lots of other areas as well, as Dr. Carr is well read and can speak on many things. And as you will find out, he is quite entertaining. But maybe a little bio on John. John started learning the ropes about pigs at about the age of 11. He qualified as a veterinarian in 1982. After 5 years in general practice, he returned to the university to complete a Leverhulme residency in pigs and the PhD in urinary tract problems of pigs at Liverpool, specializing in microbiology and pathology. He has a diploma in pig medicine and is a diplomat of the European College of Pig Health Management. He is recognized by the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons as a pig specialist. He has taught production medicine at several universities in the UK, Liverpool and Royal Veterinary College, London, in the US, North Carolina and Iowa State, and in Western Australia at Murdoch, and now at James Cook University. John runs a consultancy practice with clients in North America, Europe, Asia, Australia, and Africa. John specializes in maintaining the health of pigs through promoting excellence in stockmanship and production practices. And I think that's where we, years ago, when we met with John and started working with John, the stockmanship is really what came through for us. And as we work with our producers, it's been really good to have John on our side working with us. So really appreciate that, John. And maybe just a few housekeeping notes before I turn it over, because you didn't tune in to listen to me. This is being recorded, just so everyone's aware of that. We do want to share this later with people that couldn't attend. So it is recorded. We are going to have a Q&A at the end. That you can either message them, or you can just turn on your mic at that point and talk. We are going to ask everyone, if you haven't already, mute yourself so we don't get any feedback when John's speaking. If you don't mute yourself, we'll mute you from our end. But other than that, let's talk about Strep Suis, John, because that's why we're all here. So thank you.
Excellent. And interestingly, the Leverhulme residence that I did, Lord Leverhulme invented Lux soap. So he had coal tar and he put perfume in the coal tar because he thought that the ladies required a soap that was softer and perfumed. And that was his great invention. And he made so much money, he could actually, he helped build Liverpool University. And he had a lot of horses, and so he liked the vet school. And so when we did our final exams, we actually did it in his old house. His old house used to be was then part of the university. And there was still enough money in the 1980s that he obviously had passed away, but the funding was still available. But in the COVID-19, it's still interesting because Lux soap is useful for washing your hands and keeping you safe with COVID-19. So it was a good invention. Okay, so with no further ado as such, I will open. We can see my slides. Dwayne?
Yes.
Yeah,
it's a lot clearer than the picture before.
Yeah, well, the picture before unfortunately represents my office because I've got a light right behind me, which would blind you guys, and it's dark outside, so I'm kind of stuffed with my lighting. So anyway, let's talk about Strep Suis. As Dwayne says, we'll do a quick Q&A at the end, but clearly if there was something that you particularly wanted to question, then please do so. And so what we're going to do this afternoon is to look at this very interesting bacteria and its impact on pigs. In some respects, I'm going to talk about Streptococcus, not just Streptococcus suis. So what you can see already on the slide is this is a bacterial slide. This is called a blood agar slide, and what you take is you take some agar, which is basically some protein, and it's actually a lot of it's from a seaweed product. But you've got protein and you've got energy, and then most of the pig pathogens that we play with, you'd also add some blood, because most of the pathogens that or bacteria that become pathogens often require blood to grow. And in the streptococci that you can see here, you see the classic bacteria little colonies on this blood plate. And this is a classic streptococci appearance. This is after about 24, 36 hours. And you can see the relatively small colonies. If you had E. coli, for example, the colonies would be about twice the size. But anyway, these are things that are important more for the vets than it is for farmers as such. See if I can move to the next slide. And COVID-19 is a virus. Streptococcus suis is a bacteria. It's an interesting bacteria. So the viruses are about 1,000 times smaller than this bacteria. And this bacteria, this is now viewed down the microscope. And you can see, you can just about see it anyway. And this bacteria, Streptococcus suis, is called a gram-positive because it stains purple under a special stain that was invented by Dr. Gram. A gram-negative bacteria would be an E. coli, for example, or Salmonella. But the other thing about it is that it's a circle, and I can see it as a circle, and it is in chains. So this one here, where you've got the multiple bacteria in a chain, that's a classic streptococci appearance. And this one here, you've got 3. There's got 3 over here. There's another 3. And this is how they would actually exist in the pig as well, unfortunately for the pig. So because it is round, it's called a coccus, and it was found as part of some throat infection. Anyway, that's what ends up with its name, Streptococcus. Occurs in chains. It has a capsule around it, and that capsule has got like a casing around the bacteria, and that is one of the ways we characterize the organism. And Streptococcus, the organism was found in the 1880s, along with a lot of other bacteria. E. coli, just for example, this is a round organism. E. coli is a long organism, and that's called a bacillus, but it's much more has a length to it, where these are circular. So this organism was found in the 1880s. So we've known about this organism for 150 years, 160 years. Strep suis was interesting in that it was actually found quite late. It was found in about 1950s. The people, researchers found that this particular bacteria was found with meningitis cases. So where do streptococci live? Actually, kind of everywhere. I mean, kind of like everywhere. Now, this pig here, at this point, if I go back, at this point, this pig is negative to, and I'll pause it. This pig is negative to streptococci. Inside the uterus itself, it is the uterus is supposed to be negative to bacteria. That's not entirely true, but fundamentally, the piglet will be negative to things like streptococci. But just going through the vagina and being born, it is already picking up streptococci. So when people talk about elimination, you've got to basically stop the pig picking up the bacteria as it's being born. The bacteria lives very happily in the vagina. This is including Streptococcus suis. Streptococci, there are many, many types of streptococci, and in truth, a lot of them are actually important as part of our protection mechanism. The streptococci occupy the vagina, occupy the tonsils, and because they occupy the tonsils, it means that other bacteria can't. So bacteria like E. coli can't attach because the attachment places are already taken up by the streptococci and other bacteria such as lactobacilli and everything else that we try and encourage on our surfaces. So what you can see, it's present in all pigs. Almost every time you take a swab, you will find some streptococci, not necessarily Streptococcus suis, but you'll find streptococci. It's extremely common in the nose and the tonsils. It's very common on the skin, and particularly the surfaces such as the vagina or the other genital tract. It's very common. You will find it in the intestines, and it was able to grow in the intestines. But normally there are other bacteria in the intestines, as I say, like lactobacillus or E. coli. The other thing to try and remember, at least I have to try and remember from a vet's point of view, is that the wild pigs, the wild boars, they are also infected or have streptococci everywhere as well. So this is not something that's associated with our farming. This is just something that's associated with pigs. One of the downsides when people talk to me about, particularly with talk meningitis, is obviously a major problem. And when people talk about meningitis and they say, well, I'm going to try and eliminate streptococci. Well, good luck. One of the reasons that the answer is good luck is that the organism's also in other animals. So these are Anchovy cattle, actually, from Uganda. You can see the beautiful horns they have. So cows can carry a lot of streptococci, including Strep Suis. It can be actually a pathogen in sheep, particularly lambs, but also you've got things like rabbits. We're not sure about birds. People isolate it, but we're not sure whether it's just sort of going through. And unfortunately ourselves. I've spent best part of 50 years working with pigs. And me and Streptococcus suis are probably well versed with each other. And it'll be almost impossible if you kept taking swabs not to find Strep Suis associated with all of us who do pigs. It'll be either in our hair or again on our tonsils. And it's very difficult to eliminate those bacteria from us because we've grown up with them. But it would be of some relevance if we were thinking about having a farm that was negative. Because if the farm was negative, I really couldn't go to the farm. But the reality is that there are no farms that are negative. Sometimes the veterinary profession will sometimes try to think that they're negative, but personally, I've never found a farm that is negative. You can have no problems. That is different from being negative. I put this early in the presentation, not to remind myself, but also to sort of just quickly talk about it. One of the problems we have with Strep Suis is that it is zoonotic. And zoonotic means that it infects people. Zoo is animals and notic goes to people. People can infect pigs and pigs can infect people. But the pig is the primary host of Streptococcus suis. It can kill people. Normally, it causes nothing. It can lead to a meningitis, as it does in pigs, and most people do fortunately survive, which is obviously great, but it can affect the hearing. People can become profoundly deaf after an infection of Streptococcus suis. There has been outbreaks. The mortality rate with Strep Suis is probably 1% or so, but majority of pig farmers and people who work with pigs will be immune because we've had experience of the virus, of the bacteria. It can be a potential problem with my students if they've come from a city and have never had any real dealing with animals before. It's just one of those things you have to be aware of. One of the worst outbreaks we had was in China, and the issue in China, something like 200 people died. I mean, it was pretty horrible. And so everybody, this is something like 20 years ago, and so everybody panicked because when we thought there was a new type of Strep Suis that was killing people big time. And what actually had happened was that they had a pig farm, a very big pig farm, had a massive meningitis problem. They had buried the pigs close to the farm. And unfortunately, these people went and dug the dead pigs up, and they didn't cook the food properly. And then they had this massive outbreak of meningitis, which is truly horrible. But it's more of a one-off. I mean, you don't really expect people to dig up your dead animals and then not cook them. Okay, Strep Suis, Streptococcus suis. The textbook talks about causing problems in pigs that are 5 to 10 weeks of age. That's true, although I would make it bigger myself. I certainly see problems in the farrowing house, and I can see problems in the growing house, which are clearly much bigger than the 30 kilos. And we'll talk a little bit about those two outside scenarios. But it would be true that almost all my problems occur in the nursery. So the pigs will be probably around 10 to 20 kilos when they're getting the major problem of meningitis. And this is the trouble with looking at the textbook, because the textbook tends to talk about meningitis. But what you find with Streptococcus suis is that there are a range of clinical signs, and we'll go through each of these as clinical cases. Just talk a little bit more about the bacteria, just to sort of finish the bacteria itself before we look at some cases. One of the problems, this is sadly in the Philippines, one of the problems is that a dead pig certainly will carry the bacteria for a couple of weeks. And if dogs scavenge the dead pigs, or you have rats or even flies, then that will certainly spread the bacteria between farms and back onto your own farm. And I put this in really to remind us that we've got to dispose of our dead animals appropriately, and make sure that they are buried or incinerated or sent to the knacker yard. But we cannot afford to leave them lying around. Now we'll talk a little bit about this outbreak in the Philippines at the end, because this is another type of streptococci, but it's particularly nasty, which is killing sows. When you look at when you do cleaning, what I put this in is that in feces, the streptococci can last about a week. So when you're talking about your batching system, you want to we don't leave buildings empty a week because it's just too expensive. But you've got to get rid of all the feces, because the bacteria will live in the feces. It'll be protected by the feces. And so the next group of pigs will have contact with the feces, probably eat them or lick them, but the streptococci from the last group will move to the next group through the feces. Interestingly, the dust that's in a pig building, because it's very dry, the dust, the bacteria lives for maybe just a couple of hours, particularly when it's warm. And our nurseries, for instance, are obviously quite warm, around 25 to 30 degrees. And that's warm enough to kill streptococci in dust fairly rapidly. But it is not hot enough to kill streptococci in feces. So again, what I'm trying to say is that this encourages me to make sure that between batches of pigs, I must get rid of the feces, and we must make sure we are well and clean. And just having it surface clean is not going to be enough to try and reduce the amount of streps in the building. It doesn't necessarily stop the meningitis, but it will reduce the amount of streps. And obviously, we need to dispose of any fallen stock quickly. One of the problem, or what you'll hear when you talk about Streptococcus suis, is that we'll often talk about Streptococcus suis type 2. And as I go around the world, it does vary. 2 is often very common, but there are at least 35 different types of Streptococcus suis. There are many hundreds of types of streptococci, but there are at least 35 different types. So, for instance, you have type 2 causing meningitis, but also type 9 and type 14, and this can get very confusing. And then type 1 can cause abscesses, and then type 1.5, I mean, who the hell puts a half in a type? But anyway, and so these things can become very confusing. But it also is important from a vet's point of view, because it means that there are so many different types. It can also be very difficult when you're trying to make a vaccine, in terms of exactly why does the vaccine not work. And one of the reasons is that you vaccinate against type 2, but then type 9 causes a problem, or type 14 causes a problem. And you keep then adding all of these types to your vaccine, and your vaccine becomes very complicated. And so what I put here is that, so in the UK, type 2 probably accounts for about 70 or 80% of the meningitis cases. But in Canada, it's only about 20% of the cases. So it does go around the world, the types, but the clinical problems I see in Canada are the same as what I see in Australia, are the same as what I see in England. So despite the type of Strep suis, the clinical signs are the same. So this is a electron microscope, and you can clearly now see the round shapes in the chains. That's a beautiful photograph of Strep suis. The color is artificial, but it reminds me that it's a gram-positive color, so that this would not be the color in life. Okay, we've got a bacteria which we can grow easily. We've got a bacteria we can recognize easily. It's got a little pimply shape. It's got a bit of a capsule, sort of sticky bit to it. We've known about it for 150 years, and we don't know how it works. We are, with DNA technology, you take the bacteria apart. I mean, bacteria are relatively complicated. It has a cell wall, a bit like a plant in that sense. It has a cell wall, has DNA in the middle. It has mechanics, and they're very old organisms. But we don't even know how it manages to attach to a cell in order to do its thing. It doesn't really produce any toxins like E. coli. We know an awful lot more about E. coli, and when you look at our E. coli vaccines, most of our vaccines nowadays, we don't give pigs E. coli, we give pigs parts of E. coli. We give them the attachments, we give them the toxins. And with Strep suis, we didn't know much 50 years ago, and we don't really know that much now, in terms of how exactly that it works. This is a very odd word, opsonization. One of the problems with Streptococcus suis is that what we do know is it does stick to cells. And one of the things, see, normally it's in the tonsils, sticking to the surface of the cells in the tonsils. What it can do, these are macrophages, which are very large cells that go and eat other bacteria. And they're amazing and a very important part of our immune system. But unfortunately, what Streptococcus suis appears to be able to do is it's able to convince this cell that it's not a pathogen. And then these cells will actually take it around the body. And when you vaccinate, or the pig is very stressed, then the pig appears to become more sensitive to bacteria, as in the bacteria seem to go around the body even faster, which is really the last thing the body needs when the animal is stressed. Okay, so if there was any questions about the organism itself, I can try and answer them towards the end. So what we most of us are interested in the clinical signs, and what am I going to do about it? So what clinical problems we can have? Well, one of the classic clinical problems we can have is we just found the pig's dead. For some reason, the bacteria that's sitting on the pig's tonsils gets into the bloodstream, and it then rapidly multiplies in the bloodstream, and that's called a bacteremia. So as in you have bacteria in emia, which is in the blood. So when you have a bacteremia, you have blood you have bacteria in the bloodstream. Sometimes the pigs have what's called recurrent fever or undulating fever. So they'll have, 42 degrees centigrade is very hot. Erysipelas will give you a temperature of about 41. African swine fever, which is pretty horrible, obviously, will give you a temperature of 42. So we're looking at pretty extreme temperatures. And so the sudden death syndrome associated with streptococci can look a little bit like African swine fever. The difference is that this problem almost always is just in young animals. They'll be around, as these pigs are, 15 to 20 kilos, whereas African swine fever is generally much older, or African swine fever will attack everybody, whereas an erysipelas is generally much older. You generally get your erysipelas problems in pigs that are 60 to 100 kilos. So when I go to a farm and I have a couple of dead pigs like this, then streptococci would be one of the things that I'd be thinking about, but also would be glasses as well. But we'll talk about that as well. So the bacteremia can kill very quickly, but what we have found is that some of the pigs will cope with the bacteria in their bloodstream for up to 3 weeks. And any time during that 3 weeks, they could just drop dead. And when you post-mortem them, you find nothing because they've died so rapidly. There really isn't any clinical signs. If you do histology, then you might be able to find some indication that there's a problem. I'll just turn the volume down. This is probably much more classic thing that we see, a pig with meningitis, because it is just quite interesting that one of the signs, but most of us don't necessarily really listen to it. One of the signs is that the squeak can change its tone. So the pig has a very high pitched squeak, which is what, whoops, let us go back. Which is what I'm trying to put the volume back up. And what happens here is that the streptococci also affect the tonsils area, and it can give you an edema of the tonsils. The voice box changes a little bit. Sorry, and that changes the voice of the pig, and so you have this very high-pitched squeal. But what you have here is the classic meningitis that I assume that almost all of us have met from time to time, where the pig appears to suddenly collapse, will paddle with its legs, be unable to walk. In the very early stages, it might just appear to be incoordinated, but then will fall over. The pig, as I say, will bash its head around. It can damage its head as it bashes its round. When it dies, what you quite often will see is then this part of if this was some bedding or whatever, you'll see the typical thrashing of the pig. The pig will be on its side with all four legs out like that. Sometimes they can be outstretched, and it is very rapid. This pig could well have been perfectly normal 20 minutes ago, and then has collapsed like this. Assuming it survives, it can have permanent brain damage. If there's somebody wanting control, if there is recovery, it can take probably a couple of weeks, maybe even a month or so to really recover back to normal. But as I say, the one of the problems can be that you get brain damage, and that can be quite permanent. So one of the things about meningitis, which I try to teach, we can go to the next slide as well, which just shows. So these are piglets. This is in a nursery pig. Here we see a pig in the farrowing house, and what you have here is that the same. You can have the same type of problems, but the pig basically can be very quiet in the farrowing house. So these pigs are separated from the rest of the group, but these two pigs are having a problem. And as you walk around the farrowing house, you notice that the rest of the pigs are okay, and then you've got these two pigs, and particularly this one up against the wall here, which is clearly not normal and is sort of twitching. And when you try to pick it up, you'll find that the pig falls over and rolls over. You can see there is marks on them, so the stockman has recognized them, these three, as being different from the rest of the pigs. Now, the big issue about meningitis is your treatment has got to be aggressive. You have a very, very, very important or clinical problem. You've got bacteria in the brain, and if you don't treat them quickly, they will die. And what I argue with my clients, particularly when you're talking to 16, 17-year-olds, trying to encourage them about how to treat these animals, is Streptococcus suis, a meningitis case, is something you don't go and have your lunch. You don't mark the pig, go for lunch, and then come back in the afternoon and treat it. Meningitis, if you're on the way to lunch and you see a case of meningitis, you don't go for lunch. You go to the medicine store and you treat the animal. The sooner you get some penicillin into these pigs, the better. You don't go for a coffee. You don't even go for a pee. I mean, fundamentally, you go and fix the pig. This is an emergency. This is a medical emergency. The sooner you can get the antibiotics into the pig, the sooner this pig will be healed. And the other important thing is that meningitis is extremely painful. Now, that's fortunately not from personal experience, but talking to people who have had meningitis, not streptococcus, but meningitis, and just talking from a medical point of view, meningitis is extremely painful. And one of the success rates of treating pigs with meningitis is to use Metacam, is to use pain relief. I have a sign saying that my internet's not very good, but I take it you can all hear me still fine. So we have, you've got to be extremely aggressive. And I personally prefer to use Ceftiofur XNL for my cases of meningitis, but there are around the world, I'm being encouraged to not use XNL and to go back to using penicillin. The second thing about treatment, and we'll talk a little bit about that, but we'll talk about it while I'm here as well. On the first dose, I would normally double the dose of penicillin. So if this pig was going to get 0.5 ml of penicillin, I'd be giving it 2 mL of penicillin on the first dose. And I may well be injecting this animal this afternoon as well. You've got to get the antibiotic into the pig in large amounts in order to save the animal. Now, because on the last slide I had, I had this thing called a blood-brain barrier. Now, one of the things about the brain is actually outside the bloodstream. I know it sounds a bit odd, but the blood vessels, they are slightly thickened as such in the brain as such, but fundamentally it is actually difficult to get into the brain. It's difficult for bacteria to get into the brain, and also it's difficult for antibiotics to get into the brain. So penicillin on a normal day would actually not get into the brain. You put it into the shoulder and it'll go around the body, but it'll not get into the brain. But when you've got a case of meningitis, you have inflammation of the brain, and at that point, then these antibiotics are able to get through into the brain and treat the animals. But that's one of the reasons why I would give a good dose. And I say what I recommend is a double dose immediately. Then I might give another dose later on that afternoon, and then the next day, and then maybe a long-acting on the third day. But do remember the treatment with Metacam. A lot of these pigs are also very light sensitive with meningitis, and so I would normally remove them to somewhere where it is dark. They can be very sensitive to noise, so I would put them in a darkened area that is quiet. This is maybe more so in the nursery, but even in the farrowing house here. So I would pick them up, put them on their own. There's no point to other pigs. So you have these pigs here all being very curious about what's going on. And pigs being pigs, they will walk on this pig and they will nudge this pig and they will, hurt this pig. And there's nothing this pig can do. And the three videos are designed to sort of remind us that it occurs in despite what the textbook says, it can occur in the farrowing house. I find it occurs in the nursery, and it can occur in the grower house. This particular pig died, and what I'm doing here is just doing a post-mortem to try and look at the pig's brain. We'll move on. So, treating pigs with meningitis, penicillin and the penicillin family, of which amoxicillin or ceftiofur would be my medicine of choice. This is an outbreak in China where we had a group of relatively poor pigs in the nursery, and we have certainly one pig here with meningitis as well. The tetracyclines, which is something that medication is often in the feed, we might use in the feed. Doxycycline, for example, in the nursery, generally are not suitable, partly because they can't get into the brain very well. And as put here, meningitis is extremely painful. Try to have them in a warm environment, which is darkened and quiet, and ideally with a little bit of bedding, so that the pig can sort of bury itself into the straw and try and feel comfortable. You try and get it to sit up, and you've got to turn the pig. Otherwise, if you just leave the pig down on the ground, then what will happen is all the fluid in its chest will go onto one side of its chest rather than the other, and the pig will drown. One of the mistakes that I find with my clients, and we talk about when we try about the treatment of these animals, is that we inject them. We give them Metacam, we inject them, we separate them, we put them like this, and then we walk away. And it's like, well, we've turned the lights down, we've made them quiet, John, what more do you want us to do? Well, the pig doesn't necessarily want food, but the pig does want water. A lot of pigs die of meningitis actually because they end up with salt poisoning or water deficiency, which is another neurological problem. And if that pig has no water, the clinical signs will sort of get better, and then they'll go worse again. And when they're going worse, it may well be that actually what the pig's now getting is salt poisoning rather than anything else. You've got to try and water these animals. And that can be difficult, very, very time consuming. You're sitting there with your syringe, and the pig's spitting most of the water back out, but you've got to try to do as much as you can if you're going to try and have any real success in pulling these pigs back. It's just very sad, but it's very intensive. There's clearly a lot of other things going wrong in these pigs, of which most of it is glasses. But the meningitis pig is, I would actually argue there's too many pigs in this pen. Anyway, I'd have made a couple of pens so that the better pigs are separated from the meningitis pig. Interestingly, when you look at a population of pigs, probably about 20%, 30% of the pigs carry Streptococcus on their tonsils all the time. When you have a meningitis outbreak, that number can jump to about 100%, 90%. And out of that 100, maybe 2 or 3 pigs will go down with meningitis. And that's actually very similar to what happens in human beings. We don't have Streptococcus, but we have another bacteria that causes meningitis. And we have the same problem there, that normally what happens is 20% of school children have the organism in their tonsils all the time. When you have a lot of stress, the population number can get to about 90%. And then, unfortunately, 1 or 2 children then develop clinical signs. And it's equally devastating in man. And this is then a checklist of which Dwayne can provide for you guys to look at afterwards. But I want to concentrate more through this checklist a little later on when I sort of talk about treatment in general. But the one thing which I just want to think about a little bit is, as Dwayne said right from the word go, is there's an awful lot at the back here all about management. Pig flow, all in, all out, medicine use, water, food, floor, air. It's the management of the situation that matters. The treatment of the sick pigs, to my mind, is a relatively small problem. It's trying to figure out how to stop the problem in the first place. Okay, Streptococcus suis and Streptococcus in general also can play a role in other conditions. So we are used to seeing it in the meningitis cases, and I've said that we can also have pigs which just drop dead. It also plays a role in polyserositis or Glasses disease, and in my experience, Glasses disease is not just Glasserella parasuris, or was Haemophilus parasuris. It's changed its name. Not that the organism care or the pigs care. My students care, such because they try to pass their exams. But what you have here are 2 pigs with glasses. They've gone very hairy. They're having trouble breathing. This one's clearly having some pneumonia as well. It's got purple ears, and that means the word is cyanosis. It's going blue, and that means its heart is failing as well. So it's probably got pleurisy, it's got pneumonia, it's got pericarditis, and I wouldn't be surprised if it had infection of the around the intestines as well. And this is another very poor looking pig. And the classic glasses, where you open the pig up and the pig is full of peritonitis. You've got fluid and stuff around the heart at the top end here and around the lungs. Now, there's a difference between Haemophilus parasuris, which is the classic cause of Glasses disease, and Streptococcus suis. The Streptococcus causes this purulent material. It causes this abscess, causes this pus that you can see, the yellow pus in the chest at the top here, but also all this the yellow around the liver. Maybe just pause it so it doesn't get. Pause it there. So you have the yellowing of the tissues, and you've got this very yellow material that's in the chest, and that is typical of streptococci. If you've got straightforward glasses, this material here tends to be more colorless, or it looks more like blister fluid. You still have the fluid, but you don't have this sort of yellow color to it. And so once you start getting what looks more like an abscess, then there's more to it than just Haemophilus parasuris, and streptococci are very common. Now, this pig is clearly a little bit bigger. It's probably about 40, 45 kilos. But these clinical signs will have been there for probably since just after weaning, or maybe even from birth. And we'll talk a bit more about this. An awful lot of these conditions come through the umbilicus, but it can also come through from poor teeth clipping, can come through the foot, and then settles into the chest and the abdomen. So when as a vet I open this pig up, and this pig can look remarkably normal until you open it up, and you go, oh, how the hell did it manage to survive? Because it's just the pig is so sick inside, and yet on the outside it can look well. And that's why we end up with some of these pigs are condemned in the slaughterhouse. So we take them all the way to 120, 25 kilos, and then the slaughterhouse opens them up and they see this, and obviously then they just throw the carcass away. Outside the glasses problem, streptococci can also cause problems with pneumonia, but almost always as a secondary problem. So you can see this pig has been sick for a little while. It's clearly having trouble breathing. You can see the ridge back coming down the back, and this pig is probably not terribly well either. But what you have here on this farm is probably a PRRS problem combined with some mycoplasma. So the mycoplasma and the PRRS has damaged the immune system of the respiratory tract. The streptococci are sitting on the tonsils in a normal pig. And when you have the defense mechanism of the lung damaged, then the streptococci move from the tonsils down into the lung, and then you have abscessation in the lung. So moving outside, so we have the tonsils infecting the pig respiratory tract, and that can, and also then get into the blood, and then move into the heart. What you can also have are, before you see me opening the pig up, what we can also have is these swollen joints. Very common for, this is more, we call that Streptococcus type 2. This would be more typical of other types of streptococci. Now, what is also interesting, though, is that what I find with my pigs with meningitis, they quite often will start off with a swollen leg. So if you are watching the pigs a lot, then when you start having pigs with swollen legs, that's when I start thinking about, should I be medicating before I even get meningitis. So it's something that you could watch when you're in the nursery. If you get a couple of pigs where the legs start getting thicker than normal, put a mark on them and then see how many of those get meningitis. And if they don't, then fine. But if you do start seeing a correlation between a swollen leg and meningitis, then it could be an earlier indication rather than falling over. But this particular pig, you can see, has a swollen joint. So this leg here is swollen, and then when I post-mortem, we euthanize the pig and we post-mortem the pig, and then you see the yellow pus-filled abscess on the joint, and what you have, joint ill actually rather than till, joint ill. What you have here is the infection has got either into the joint itself, which is where it's swollen, and therefore you can't lance that, or more typically around the muscles. Each of the muscles have to move, and so there's a little capsule around the muscles, and the organism actually gets inside this capsule, and either way the problem ends up being quite devastating to the pig. And you can see how when I open up the pig's leg, how you end up with the infection deep inside the pig. And again, some of these will recover, but you end up with you will end up with some arthritis in the pig, And if that happens, then the slaughterhouse may condemn that portion of the pig. It certainly would condemn this leg. If you start having an abscess like this, it is liable that the slaughterhouse could condemn the whole carcass. But those pigs recover, but then can be seen in the finishing herd having quite arthritic lesions, as you can see, unfortunately, for this pig here. And you can see how it's knuckling over on its leg and is unable to walk very well. Now, it doesn't mean that this pig has had joint ill, but the organism may well have come up through the foot, or it could come through the teeth, but the organism settles into the joints, and then you end up with an arthritic pig. But as is typical in veterinary science, this could be streptococci, but it could also be mycoplasma. It could be a genetic problem if it's in multiple pigs as well. But certainly streptococci is one of the causes of arthritis in the pig. And then depending on, I find abscesses horrible. Depending on what you have, is you can have an abscessation. And so here we see a cell with a large abscess. Now this is you can find streptococci in this, but you may also find multiple other bacteria, of which one of them, these are all words, but it's called Truparella pyogenes. And you can see the massive bacteria, the massive abscess. It does disappoint me at times that as an industry, we tend to leave these abscesses to get quite gross. And it really would be nicer if we could try and lance them earlier. Now, one of the big problems with lancing the pig, we've given the pig a little bit of local, but it's clearly not working terribly well. But when you lance the abscess, you want to lance the abscess as low down as possible because you want it to drain. And one of the problems with abscesses is that people don't make a big enough cut. And ideally, what I'm trying to do just now is actually make the cut into a cross. So you make a cross cut. And the purpose of doing that is that the abscess will not close over quickly. You want that abscess to be open for at least 3 to 5 days. And so what I've done now is I've made a big enough hole, the abscess is being drained. And what I would then do next is take actually a garden hose and put the garden hose in that hole and flush. It's all pretty horrible. One of the big problems with abscesses is that the antibiotics you put into the neck, because we drain the abscess, then we give her a shot of amoxicillin or something. The big problem we have with abscesses is that it's walled off. The abscess has a capsule, which I can feel underneath my fingers as I empty it. It has a capsule, and that capsule stops the antibiotics getting, I don't think we need to see it again. The abscess stops the antibiotics getting into the capsule, stops the antibiotics getting into the abscess. So when you lance the abscess, don't just give them a shot in the neck. You lance the abscess and then you flush it. And say, I use a garden hose for an abscess of that's this size. Put a garden hose in and flush it 3-4 times a day. And you can use some hydrogen peroxide, soap and water. Those things are going to be more effective than your antibiotics. And if you want to put something in, then you could put a cow intermammary antibiotic in, something that would be used for treating mastitis in the cow. Or you take some penicillin in the syringe and inject, clean the abscess out, flush it out, and then inject the antibiotic straight into the abscess. But putting it, just lancing it and then making a small hole, draining some out, and then stabbing the pig in the neck is really not enough. You need to be, again, more aggressive. The other problem that streptococci can cause, because it gets into the bloodstream with this bacteremia, is that the bacteria are able to settle on the heart valves. So this is the heart, this is the left-hand side of the heart. So this pump will, when it pumps blood out to the whole body. The other side pumps blood to the lungs. And so what you have here are lumps on the heart valve, and these look like cauliflower lesions. Veterinarians are not terribly imaginative people. So you have these cauliflower lesions on the heart valves, and inside these you have bacteria colonies. And what happens every so often is a few bacteria escape, and it's called seeding. And so they escape and they seed the body, and so they will constantly produce abscesses, lung problems, and foot problems from these valvular lesions. And this one you can actually see there is lumps on this valve, but quite often we won't even see it. It'll be there, but you'd have to do histology to even find it. But this is one of the problems with treating for a condition like streptococci. It can be extremely difficult. Okay, we think so there. So what we've done is we've got a range of problems that streptococci can cause, from just sudden death, the classic meningitis that we're all sadly familiar with, through to abscesses and joint ill, and then some arthritis, which is more chronic, and this valvular changes to the heart, which makes the pig have more trouble breathing and pumping its blood around. And then people, that's not really true. Wild pigs have the same level of bacteria as our commercial pigs. It would be true that we then have a duty of care to manage our farm pigs as well as we can. And if we manage them as best as we can, then we will reduce the level of the infection. Prevention, I think, is impossible control, possibly. I just put here just to remind myself as well that we do get much more problems when we're having PRRS breaks or flu breaks, but there almost always is some underlying meningitis problem. From a vet's point of view, diagnosing it, we saw this a little bit before with my post-mortem, any sound, and I'm doing a post-mortem, looking for the signs. Checking the brain is actually extremely difficult. Personally, I can't tell you whether the pig has got meningitis or not looking at the brain. But what I can do is I can take a section of this brain and send it into the lab, and the lab can have a look at the brain down the microscope. And this is more normal brain, and this area up here with all these little blue dots and everything else, that is both the bacteria and the infection around the brain, causing swelling. And you can see how swollen that is, because normally the meninges would be attached to the top of the brain. So this is very swollen, it's causing pressure on the brain, and all of these things lead to the clinical signs we have. If we find the bacteria, we would grow it on a plate. This is a slightly different plate, but each one of these discs are different antibiotics. And what you can see is around these antibiotics, there is a zone of clearing, that's what it's called. So you plate the bacteria onto the plate, you put the antibiotic in these little discs. These are different antibiotics. So this antibiotic here, for instance, there is no effect on the bacteria. The bacteria is growing all the way up to this disc, where in this one it's working really well. The bacteria can't get anywhere near the disc. And so this would be, if I would pick this antibiotic, or maybe these antibiotics would be clearly sent. The organism cannot grow in the presence of these antibiotics, and so this is doing a plate culture that tells me which antibiotic to use. But all of this stuff's fantastic. We do histology. We'll get the vet involved. We'll do the plating. We'll cut some pigs up, but reality is we need to really stop this happening in the first place. We can't rely on antibiotics as a treatment. What we have to do is we've got to try and control this. And I'm going to talk a little bit about navel dipping in a minute. But all of those things that Dwayne talked about right from the beginning, about basic stockmanship. We've got to reduce some of the temperature fluctuations. I've had a major problem in the UK. This last 2 weeks, the UK is not used to very cold weather. And what's happened in the UK is we've lost a number of pigs because the temperatures got down to -5. From a Canadian point of view, you're just laughing, thinking, well, how the hell can't you cope with -5? But our buildings, the UK buildings, are not insulated enough. We often have damp floors. The buildings are built for about +10, and when it gets to -5, our pigs have just got exposure, and they just chilled and died. And it's really almost quite embarrassing, because you don't want the general public to know what's going on. But we've got to try and reduce the temperature fluctuation, certainly the extremes, reduce the mixing of pigs. I want to put no batching, as in, I want batching to control. The question is, if there's no batching, I need to impose a batching. One of the problems we do have is making sure that our gilts are acclimatized so that they can pass on the immunity in the colostrum. When we talk about the problems in the farrowing house, you get meningitis in the farrowing house, you've got a colostrum problem. The pig should be well able to protect its babies until weaning. After weaning, the colostrum, with streptococci, the colostrum doesn't do anything. But before weaning, the colostrum should protect the piglets. And so when you start getting meningitis, greasy pig disease in the farrowing house, then that's telling me that we're not getting the acclimatization of our gilts properly. Overcrowding, poor ventilation, they are classic problems, and can be very difficult, and really all in all out is about all we have in order to try and control it. Now we've got 2 videos playing, and I just wanted to sort of talk about these. So this was a farm in Iowa where we had 8% mortality in the nursery associated with Streptococcus suis, meningitis. Often very acute death. We'd find them dead in the morning, but in the pose it looked like a meningitis pig. So the pigs died very rapidly, but we still had some pigs we had to treat. So at 8% mortality in the nursery, which is 3-4 times more than it should be. And the local vet had tried everything. We'd tried vaccines, they'd tried putting antibiotics in the feed, put antibiotics in the water. We'd even given all the pigs Draxxin at weaning, and it made relatively little difference. And so they invited me in, as it happens, to go and have a look at the buildings. And one of the things that I noticed was that the pigs were defecating at the back of the pen, and the pigs were all sleeping up at the front of the pen. Well, at the front of the pen, what you've got are the feeders and the drinkers. So if we just let the video run to about there, you probably now can't see it. But you can see how here you've got a feeder and the drinker, and the pigs are supposed to be sleeping at the back of the pen. That was the design of the house. And you can see when Andy puts the smoke in, the inlets are actually the air's getting to here and then stopping and then falling onto the back of the pigs. And that's because there's another inlet over here, and the 2 inlets are meeting each other with such speed, they're dropping the air onto the back of the pigs at this point. So we've got a very severe draft affecting the pigs where the pigs are supposed to sleep. And the pigs then are forced to sleep by the drinkers, which is when it's wet. See the oops. And so what we did, because what we did was, there's a passageway here and there's a passageway on the other side of the house. Now what I wanted to do, and I still would encourage people to do, is to actually open up the whole house so the pigs can make a choice as to where they want to sleep. What the farm decided to do, though, was to move the inlets. So we moved the inlets from above the passageway. So we moved the inlets to above the pig sleeping area. This is what we've done here. So now the inlets are above the pig sleeping area. Now the air is still hitting another bank of air from the other inlet, but now the air is falling into the passageway. So now the pigs are sleeping where they're supposed to sleep, in a draft-free area, and they're sleeping away from the feeders and the drinkers where there's a lot of activity. So this farm has an 8% mortality in the nursery associated with Strep Suis, and this farm had a 2% mortality associated with Strep Suis. The farm, which is maybe more normal, okay, we still have some Strep Suis, so, but we seriously stopped the mortality and the clinical signs. We used an awful lot less medicines between these two farms. And the only thing we changed was where the air was. What I did have is I had quite annoyed staff, because the staff would come in and they'd feel the draft, but in truth, the staff didn't get meningitis and they'd have to treat them. So the staff unfortunately had to put up with it. I still argue we should have had a bigger house, a big pen, but this is what the farm did. And so, but you can quite clearly see here, is because we put the inlet above the sleeping area, the air travels across and then hits the passageway, and the pigs themselves are much, much happier. Now, so the farm was dramatic. The farm was very pleased. We took out the vaccine, in truth, we took out the antibiotics to control meningitis. So we reduced the costs of production. We reduced the mortality from 8% down to 2%, which is more normal in a nursery, and everybody's happy. We did have problems in one room. So we had problems in where one room, the mortality didn't really make that big a difference. The changing the inlet didn't make that very much difference. Now what you see here is we put the smoke in, but this light acted as a barrier. And so the smoke hit the light and then fell back onto the pigs. So the pigs were still stressed. The air has not managed to get to the passageway and stress the stockman, but the air is hitting this barrier and then getting down onto the back of the pigs. And so we then moved the light, and the air then traveled to the passageway, and the response to the pigs became dramatic. You just go to the next one. Navel dipping. Navel dipping is something that is very old. And these are some friends of mine in the Philippines. And I'm not necessarily, they obviously it would be quicker than this. This is something that I'm encouraging people to seriously think about. So we are putting a lot of care into the pig at birth, which is what most of us do. But I wonder how many of us are navel dipping and have not just sort of abandoned the practice of doing it. But the reason that I encourage people to navel dip is that the pig has been born through the vagina, as we saw right from the word go, and the pig has been picking up Streptococcus as it passed through the vagina. We've got a wet navel. We've got Streptococcus in the environment. And with the wet navel, then it's easier for the organism to get in. I personally would probably take the navel dip to the pig rather than the other way around. We don't touch the navel. We don't cut the navel at all. We just leave everything alone, and we're going to do some split suckling. But on this particular farm, well, actually, that would be true. On a British farm, we had excellent genetics. We had 16, 17 born alive. We had a small amount of meningitis in the farrowing house, which was annoying, but we had a big problem in the nursery. And unlike the last case in Iowa, I couldn't necessarily find what the environmental problem was. And we were injecting 60 pigs a week, and I'm just trying to think how many pigs we'd have in a group. So we'd probably have something like 2,000 pigs, and we're injecting 60 pigs a week with Betamox, with amoxicillin, in order to try and stop and control meningitis, which is way too many. For instance, I might not want to touch the navel with my hands, but it's whatever. So we instigated navel dipping, because I noticed that a number of the pigs with meningitis, and we had a problem with Glasses disease, but a number of the pigs also had a swollen navel. And when he post-mortem the pigs in the nursery, too many of them had what looked like an infection of the navel. So I reinstated, they stopped doing navel dipping. They thought it was too old-fashioned, too time-consuming. So we reinstated navel dipping, and as soon as we started doing navel dipping, the Glasses disease not quite disappeared, but went very low. Meningitis almost disappeared. So instead of treating 60 pigs a week, we started to treat 2 or 3. So instead of having like 6 bottles of amoxicillin a week, we were doing 1 or 2 bottles a month, and it was very dramatic on the medicine bill. And obviously the clinical signs in the pig was important. So again, I have my checklist, of which some of you can. It's a bit small, but I've got to get my pig flow right. I've got to make sure that I'm farming the right number of pigs. We don't need overstocking. We don't need understocking. If we have too many pigs, it'll be too hot. If we don't have enough pigs, then it'll be too cold. And part of the problem we had in England this week is that there'd probably been too few pigs in the pen, and the pigs just got too cold. We want all in, all out my pigs. I want no more than 7-day variance in a group of pigs, whether that's a 3-week batch, 2-week batch, 1-week batch, whatever you do. I want basically just the pigs to be 7 days apart. When I'm doing injections, I want to make sure that the injections are nice and clean. And I don't use needles and syringes, certainly between different batches of pigs. The streptococcus can be in the blood. As I said, 3 weeks, the streptococcus can be in the blood, and the pig doesn't necessarily show that many signs. And so when you inject the needle out, like you could be moving PRRS, you can move things like streptococci. We need good quality water, and the water has to be of adequate flow, good flooring. Make sure that the room is warm enough in the nursery, but then cooled. It is very frustrating, I find, on a number of my pig farms, where we have 27 degrees, 26 degrees on entry for a couple of days. Then we go into a temperature cooling curve. So then it gets down to 27. And then in week 8, 9, or 10, the temperature goes back up to 30 degrees. And then we move them to the grower house, where they're down at 22. And it's just bouncing the temperature around just does not help. I've put gas heating and other gases. I'm getting increasingly interested in carbon dioxide, but we have carbon dioxide sensors are very difficult because our pig environments destroy a lot of the sensors. But the carbon dioxide measure, when I have managed to get the machine to work, the carbon dioxide has recorded 2,000 ppm or more. And certainly I get more meningitis when I have poor quality air. Normal air is about 400 ppm, and you start feeling sleepy at about 1,500 ppm carbon dioxide. And that's probably the carbon dioxide of, say, an office. You start getting over 2,000, 2,500, people will start falling asleep at work and will start making a lot of errors on the computer. And that, sadly, is quite common in our pig buildings. Now, I'm happy to take any arguments that your vaccines work. In my experience, the vaccines are generally a waste of time for two reasons. One is that there are 35 different types of this bacteria, and I can start chasing bacteria. There's generally multiple types on the same farm, although one type tends to cause more of the problem. But if I vaccinate, what happens is that I take out that one type, and then another type starts becoming a problem. And it's a personal comment. In my experience, vaccinating pigs is generally a waste of time. I will vaccinate the sow from time to time, but that is to control meningitis really in the farrowing house. But my feedback programs is more than enough. But when I go to the farm and the farm's talking to me about vaccines, and this is the farm management of their medicines, well, we're not talking about vaccines. We're talking about improving bottle hygiene, needle hygiene. I mean, some of the needles and syringes are just dreadful. And, you've got dirty bottle tops and everything else. The streptococci, okay, I did say that the dust is not going to live very long, but there's going to be streptococci on these bottles, and I'm going to be injecting it in. So what I've done this afternoon is we've talked about Strep Suis and some of the other streptococci. We've talked about this quite a horrible bacteria causing meningitis, but it can be very acute and just cause death. It can cause arthritis. It can play a role in Glasses disease, and it causes abscessation. I just want to finish with these pretty horrible slides of another streptococcus, which has been reported in Canada, and it's Streptococcus zooepidemicus. And zoo, again, is animal. Epidemicus is an epidemic, a bit like COVID-19 is an epidemic, or now pandemic, because it's gone around the world. And it's very horrible. This is a gilt, or a young sow anyway, it's actually in the Philippines. And this farm has about a 2,000 sow, 2,500 sow unit. So we were doing about 120 sows a week to farrow. And fairly suddenly, we started to have sows die. And that little video with the pig, with the dog eating the sow ear comes from this farm. And we would be losing 5 to 10, maybe even more sows in a day. I mean, it was severe enough that I actually flew to the farm to try and help. And what we found, so we got sows that are very sick. The sows were vomiting. They collapsed, and they had difficulty breathing, and then they died. And what we found inside them was a very severe peritonitis, and you can see the infection around the peritoneum. And it's not as yellow as because I wasn't thinking of Streptococcus initially. I was thinking more of Glasses. So I was looking for a Haemophilus rather than a Streptococci, because this is more typical. This is not yellow enough really to be a Streptococcus. But it's now been recognized that this is probably Streptococcus epidemicus. And I mean, our first thoughts was African swine fever, but this was before the Philippines had African swine fever. But a very big spleen. You see this organ here is the spleen, and that raised alarms with African swine fever. But African swine fever does not lead to this infection. This is clearly a bacterial problem causing the peritonitis. And we also knew fairly quickly that putting amoxicillin into these sows, I could fix the problem and stop the mortality. When we had sows in the slaughterhouse, I still had peritonitis, but the sows survived. But this is a very, very serious disease, which you won't find very much yet in the textbooks. But I think this is going to become a bigger and bigger problem. But it's just something to be aware of. If you suddenly start having sow deaths, and you start seeing this peritonitis, then start thinking of a streptococcus as a cause. We used, again, because I would normally put tetracycline, I don't normally use amoxicillin in sows. It's too expensive. I would use tetracycline. We put tetracycline in. The effects was limited. My acutely sick pigs, I gave them even Draxin, and that effect was limited, but they were probably dying anyway. And because of what I saw, and in truth, I thought it was a Haemophilus problem, not a Streptococcus problem. But amoxicillin would be the way I would treat Glasses disease anyway. So we put amoxicillin into the sows, into the water, and the effects were dramatic. The sows stopped dying. And then after that, we found that it was a Streptococcus problem. Okay, so that is my presentation on Streptococci, Dwayne.
All right.
And I look forward to some questions. This is not a pig. This is a kangaroo, and they box. They're quite impressive. This guy is about 6 foot tall. He's nearly 2 meters tall, and it's quite impressive watching them in the morning when you've got two males fighting each other. And they stand up on their back legs, and obviously they've got the tail, and then they thump each other. You don't want to mess around with kangaroos, I can tell you. And this is what I would normally be doing at 4 o'clock in the morning is I'd be maybe looking at the stars. But Grand Valley is just one of my stars that I look at.
Oh, that's quite a segue, Dr. Carr. I guess if we were doing the over under, I always take the over, and you certainly can do that. So again, thanks for all the information. Lots of good stuff there. I'm sure we're going to have questions. I know I've got one for sure. For people that are still with us, if you look on your screen, there's that little chat bubble there, show conversation. You can type your questions in there. We can go there. You can see that we've got one in there already from Seymour from Winnipeg. So Dr. Carr, the flow rate water, is it 750 mils per minute, or what are you looking for there?
In the nursery. Okay. I would look for at least, in the nursery, I want at least half a liter a minute to a liter a minute. In truth, I'm not doing that to control meningitis as such. If a pig will only drink for about 6 minutes a day, which is not very long. You can pay them, when she's lactating, she'll drink for longer because she has a higher demand of water. But fundamentally, she'll drink for 6 minutes a day. And so you've got to think, you're a 10-kilo pig, you've got to drink about a liter and a half a day. So how many minutes are you going to do that? So for instance, if you had it down at 500 mils, then you're going to be drinking at least 3 minutes just to get you 500 mils. And then majority of the water systems would probably waste about half of it. So 500 mils gets close to your 6 minutes limit in terms of what's available. So what I found, this is part of my PhD and also other people's work, is that when I was down at 500 mils, the pigs grew slower. If I'm above a liter, the pigs tend to gag on the drinker because there's like too much water going into their mouth. And it's one of the reasons why I prefer bowls in the nursery anyway, because then the pigs can drink more at their own leisure as such. So the 700 mils became a number that was between 500 and 1,000. I think 1,000 is too much water for the pigs to drink, and 500 mils, there's not enough. The pig won't drink enough minutes in the day, and what they'll do is they'll reduce their feed intake. And clearly what we want is to produce 125 kilos in around 26 weeks, and it doesn't help if the pigs are growing slowly in the nursery. We need the pigs to grow quickly all the way through. So the 700 mils is more about growth and health. And then my argument is, if you are not stressed, then you are healthier, if that makes sense.
Okay, thank you. In the chat there, we've got a few more. How effective is disinfectant on strep?
Good. I mean, it's a bacteria. So, I mean, not that some bacteria are quite nasty, but you can kill streptococci relatively easily. So I would always, when I do my cleaning, I use a disinfectant such as, I mean, not that we're selling Burcon S, but for instance, Burcon S. But there are plenty of other disinfectants, and all of them work against streptococci. But what I would encourage is not so much worry about the disinfectant. I would worry about the detergent. I think not enough people. Well, first off, is we've got to have batching and all in, all out. It is still puzzles me at times how people rush the movement from one batch to the next, or even have a couple of pigs in one pen because they're not doing so well, and then we'll clean the rest of the house. But anyway, so we've got the pigs out the house, we've got the house sort of empty, but it still disappoints me how few people use detergent. The streptococci live in the feces, and you can throw a lot of disinfectant at feces, and the feces will protect the things that's inside. You've got to get rid of the feces, and that's where I use detergent. And then the other thing I would also do is make sure that you clean the water supply, because the streptococci could well be in the water supply. But despite all of that, with streptococci, you remember that 30% of the pigs probably have it in their tonsils. And so no matter how clean you have the building, you then bring in pigs and they will reinfect, or reinfect would be the word, I suppose, would then reinfect the building.
Okay. How big is vitamin E in nursery diets?
I personally think it's very important. And now clearly Martin would be a better one to answer this question than I am.
Sure.
Martin and I would probably disagree in the sense that, and I'm just using Martin as an example of an excellent nutritionist. So Martin will worry about lowering the vitamin E to an economic level. And so the textbook will often talk about vitamin E requirements of being 60 to 80 units ppm. Now I know that we use, from Grand Valley's point of view, we use more, but that's what the national recommendations might be. As a veterinarian, I would put 250 ppm. And there is then a gulf of difference between what the nutritionist wants and what the veterinarian wants. And my argument is that you get mulberry heart disease with vitamin E, but vitamin E is very important to stimulate the immune system. In the nursery, I've weaned pigs at 4 weeks, 3 weeks of age. The pig is really designed to be weaned at 8 to 10 weeks of age. So I've weaned her very early, taken them from mum, stopped the milk going through the system. I need to boost that immune system. And so I add extra vitamin E to support the pig's immune system. I'm not adding vitamin E to support growth, which is what the nutritionists are doing. And so I put my vitamin E high at 250 ppm in order to promote growth in what are nothing more than athletes. I mean, these guys are growing very fast. They're running around. I want them to be as healthy as possible. And that's why I put a lot of vitamin E in. And I would rather use vitamin E than antibiotics. But I totally understand the nutrition side saying, well, we don't need that for nutrition. Oh, okay, that's right, we don't. But I need it for health.
Okay. We'll take a few more questions here before we wrap up. What percentage of meningitis pigs would you expect to survive if properly treated? And also, is it a good idea to use an anti-inflammatory before the penicillin injection?
Anti-inflammatory before, I suppose. I think what I'm doing is I'm probably panicking, and my pig's dying in front of me, and if I have the white stuff in one hand and the syringe is already done, I'm probably injecting the white stuff, and the clear stuff I'll inject second. I'm not entirely sure if it matters which order, because the difference between one injection and the next is probably only 30 seconds. I like the question in so much as historically I would have said the antibiotic is what matters. And but now I'm probably going to agree with the questioner that the painkiller is what matters. When you talk about survival, you actually survive better when you're not suffering. So just giving them penicillin and walking away doesn't work. Do I use the penicillin first? I don't think it really matters. I mean, I'm sort of joking about which bottle I picked up first. It probably would be that way around. I'd probably give the penicillin first, and then I'd give it a shot of Metacam, to be honest. The first part of the question is, survivability rates. If you're fast, 100%, I mean, 90%. You wait an hour, 60. You wait half a day, 30. You wait a day, 10. I mean, to my mind, and it's the same with our children. I mean, you know, if you've had children, you become hypersensitive to blotches and things on the kids' arms, because you know that and you hope your kids never do get meningitis, but life is a bit of a risk. But I'm sure you would agree with me, Dwayne. I mean, you keep looking at them, and we know from human meningitis. I mean, you've got to get in there quickly. It's you can't mess around. And the problem with a pig, of course, is we're only really walking the nursery 2 or 3 times a day. As I shut the door, a pig gets meningitis. So when I come back in 2 or 3 hours later, I could already be 2 hours late.
Okay, we're going to move on here. I'm going to go with 2 questions, and Victoria, we're going to save yours because we can talk to Dr. Carr anytime. But a question here, Dr. Carr, regarding the Strep Suis epidemicus, after initial amoxicillin treatment, did the site have several cases of Strep Suis deaths after they stopped the amoxicillin?
Yes.
Okay.
We actually had to keep the amoxicillin in for nearly 6 months.
Okay.
African swine fever is what I'm dealing with at the moment, and I'm just using like PED as a oh my god type scenario. This Strep Suis epidemicus was one of those moments. As I say, I mean, I might have even been actually with you guys in Canada. I think it was, and the Philippine guys sort of phoned me almost in tears, saying something had gone horribly wrong. We thought the sows were poisoned to start off with, because they were vomiting. So I was thinking of vomitoxin or something. I think even Martin and I talked about it at the time. And so I got on a flight and then flew straight to the Philippines. And we were on the farm basically the next day, and doing lots of postmortems, and we were losing sows right, left, and center. I mean, and they're like, I give them injections and they wouldn't get any better, and it was pretty horrible. And that's the reason why I thought I should mention it. It's still rare. I mean, it's not something that I see on a day-to-day basis, but I'm beginning to see a few more cases.
Okay. What level of humidity should we target? And I'm going to say in the nursery.
Okay. You want to be around 70 to 75%. Don't get much below 50, because then the air becomes too dry and you actually dry out the throat, dry out the windpipe, and then organisms are more able to get down into the lungs. 70% works well for the pig. If you go above 75, then what happens is the droplets start becoming, the pig becomes stressed with the becoming damp. And so you then, between 75 and 90 actually is unhealthy as well. While it is illegal, actually having humidity of about 95 to 98 is actually extremely healthy. And that's like a sweat box or a sauna. And that's why we go to the sauna, because then what happens is the water droplets are so big, the body's it washes the air, all the shit out, all of the streptococcus and everything out of the air. And so the air actually becomes very healthy. And that's the purpose of the sauna. But a sweat box is illegal as a farming method. It used to be a farming method in the 1950s, but is nowadays perceived illegal. The answer to the question would be between 50 and 70%.
Okay, and very last question from Sam Hofer. Seeing swollen joints in piglets on the sow, worse ones 10 to 12 days old, some crates with 4 to 5 piglets. Typically, what strain strep would cause this?
I'd have to look. It can be, the clinical signs are not unusual for Streptococcus suis. But as I said in the presentation, the strain that could cause that in England would be different from the strain that could cause it in Canada. And the Canadian strain in England doesn't do anything, and the English strain in Canada doesn't do anything. So I like the question, Sam. The issue is we'd have to work together on it. I mean, you'd have to get the vet involved, and my other part of my question answer might be multiple anyway. You know, I isolate 14 today, and tomorrow I'll isolate 12, and then I'll isolate 3. And Streptococci want to survive. What we have to do is figure out how to farm it and get out of its way almost.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Carr. For those on the call that don't know, Dr. Carr is actually down under in Australia. So he was willing to either get up or stay up to join us for 4 a.m. his time. So again, we really appreciate his time. We appreciate everyone joining us. Hopefully everyone can take some of that home with them and use it on their farms as we go forward. And we look forward again to meeting with people in person in the near future, we hope. And if not, we plan to do some more of these, and we'll get some feedback from everyone and hopefully be able to have Dr. Carr join us. So thank you, everyone, and have a good afternoon. And Dr. Carr, you can maybe go lay down for a bit and get up in the morning.
I will, but it's actually becoming dawn. And actually, the sky is beautiful. And so now that I'm up, I might actually go and play with my telescope and look at the moon. But,
all right.
At
Thank
least
you
I'm
very
not
much.
having a glass of wine. Okay.
Very much. Much appreciated. Thank you, Ren. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much indeed.
All right. Take care.